Hi there, welcome. If you wanted to learn more about life in the 18th century, you've come to the right place. This is our Revolution era farmhouse. Come on in. All right, so we're looking at the outside of our Revolution era farmhouse. And one of the things that we like to point out to folks is that the nice siding on the side of our house is something called Dutch milled siding. So since it's milled, it would be made by a professional and purchased with money from the farmer. It's not something that he would make on his own. So it's another one of those small signs of prosperity that still wouldn't set him aside as wealthy, but mean he's definitely doing okay. And the cool thing about it is that it's beautiful to look at. It gives the house a nice look, but this little bead on the bottom section of each panel helps channel water away, and so water is not setting on the outside of the house, and it will last longer. It won't rot as quickly. Another thing that is something that we love to point out to our visitors is that this house probably would not have been built all at the same time. It would have been built to the hall first, and that room would have been everything. It would have been mom and dad's bedroom, living room, dining room, everything. But over time, as they get more money and they have a few good harvests, then they will add the separate parlor onto their house. So you can see the seam in our house shows that this side would have been a later addition, just as we add additions onto our homes today. And so for our windows, that's something that people are usually surprised to see, that glass and windows was expensive. And again, it's like the siding, it's something that the farmer could not produce on his own, so it would cost him a little bit. It was usually imported from Great Britain, so that would have added to the cost as well. But having 4 glass windows in the house did not make him extravagant either. It just means that, again, he's had some good years of prosperity, and this home would have been passed down through a couple of generations at the very least, so that over time they can improve the way that their home looks and the comfort of the home for the people that live there. Welcome. As you enter the farmhouse, you find yourself in a room known to 18th century people as the hall, and this would be the main room for people as far as their living room, their dining room, a lot of different purposes. This is known as a 2-room farmhouse. So these 2 main rooms, both of them have several different purposes. And you can see that as you look around and see some of the items that we have out, some of the material culture items. So as you walk through, you can see that we have a dining table where we would have mealtime. The dining table is something that would be moved out into the room during meals. You would bring your food from our separate kitchen into the dining area, set the table with a nice meal, and have a rest in the middle of the day, usually between 12 and 2. And when that meal is cleared away, you would put the table against the wall as we show it now. That's called the room at rest, and that is something that you see amongst middle-class wealthy people, both in the 18th century. You see all kinds of people doing that way as far as the fashion of the time. I'm sure you've also noticed as you look around that we have several textile-related devices. We have spinning wheels, we have a loom, we have thread winders. All of those things are textile-related. Some of them would be more common in a farmhouse than others. So we have separate videos about spinning and weaving if you'd like more details on those. The one thing that I would say about it is that spinning is much more common amongst women of the 18th century before, during, and after the Revolution, because having thread and string is just super useful. And the loom, that's something that's a little bit less common, and we're going to get into that a little bit in a different video. But you're more likely to see that on a farm during the Revolution for sure. If we look over here, you can tell that people would use this area because there's usually children on a farm, and children do chores in the 18th century, certainly. They also would do lessons in the home. So this room might also work as the schoolroom, but children of all time periods need recreational time, and so they had games just as kids do today. They're just a little bit different. And so a lot of people ask us about this device right here, and this is called a childminder. So the childminder is useful for toddlers that are beginning to get into things but are too young to know that fire is hot, or not to fall downstairs. And it can kind of act as a high chair or a pack and play today to help mom get a head start on children, getting into messes and getting into dangerous stuff. So follow me and we'll go check out the parlor. All right, welcome. This is the parlor. This is the second room of the 2-room farmhouse setup that we were talking about. So for our farm and for lots of middling farmers in this area in the 18th century, the parlor was both the bedroom for the mom and dad and a public area. It was an area for entertaining. So we have several chairs in here because of that. We have our desk where the father of the farm would be doing business and keeping records for the farm, and it means if he had a business arrangement to attend to, he might invite company over and they might hash out a business arrangement in this room as well. So that concept of the master bedroom being a public area is pretty foreign to us in the modern day. That's something that we get a lot, is a very surprised reaction, but just like our hall in the other room has several different purposes, this room has different purposes as well. People in the time period didn't have as many rooms as our modern homes do, so they had to fit all the same purposes that we use an entire home for today into a smaller area. And it makes a little bit more sense when you think about it that way. So we also have a cradle right here because small babies that couldn't go upstairs to the loft with bigger kids, if they still needed mom at nighttime, they would sleep in a little cradle in here with mom and dad. You notice that we have a brick chimney in this room as well. This is something that you would see people, didn't necessarily mean that they were wealthy, but to have 2 brick chimneys in their house would mean that they're definitely not poor. So those types of things would indicate to the passerby that these people are prosperous farmers, but definitely not rubbing elbows with George Washington. Another thing that a lot of visitors are impressed by would be what's called a full tester bed. They would assume that folks of the middling sort would not have such a fancy bed. And one of the things that we will point out to people is that beds are not necessarily disposable. This could have been grandpa's bed or dad's bed, and it was passed down through the generations. Having this much fabric on a bed with these nice hangings would have been an expense. Fabric was definitely an expense, but having clothing was an expense too, and it was considered necessary. So it would not, again, set these people aside as wealthy. Just something that's nice to have makes your life more comfortable. So if you would think to yourself, what would one of the purposes be for having all of these bed hangings surrounding the bed in a world where we don't have screens in our windows, we don't have climate control for cooling the house in the summertime, or we don't have modern climate control for keeping the heat in a house with no insulation either. So if you think to yourself, I'm sure you can think of several reasons why these bed hangings would serve a practical purpose as well as being very nice looking. Okay. So the last thing I would like to point out would be something that people today usually take for granted, which is an area to do your basic hygiene tasks for day to day. We do not have a separate bathroom in our house because of course there was no plumbing in that time period in this area. So we have things like a pitcher and a basin that you would use for washing up every day. People in the past, they were, I think, a lot cleaner than most of us give them credit for, as far as they wiped off and washed their face and hit the high spots on a day-to-day basis. They just didn't submerge themselves in a tub on a day-to-day basis, which would align more with our modern way of thinking and what is hygienic. We have things like a toothbrush. That's something that we don't always think about today, but people in the 18th century knew the importance of keeping your teeth clean. And we have things like a shaving brush, because guys of the 18th century did not usually keep full beards. It just was not the fashion, so guys would be shaving. and the shaving brush would help get a nice lather from a bar of soap. If you'd like to learn more about our 18th century hygiene, leave a comment below and we might feature it in a future video. Okay, so the upstairs area of our house is an area that people of the time would call the loft. It's not a full second story because there's no separate bedrooms and you have the pitch of the roof. And so adult-sized people can't stand up. And that would make it not a very comfortable place to be most of the time, along with the fact that heat rises. And in Virginia, that makes that area pretty hot throughout most of the year. So that area is exclusively for children to sleep in. You'll see that there's some beds up there that kids would either have the option, depending on the way their family is, of a raised rope bed or a pallet bed on the floor. And if you'd like to learn more about rope beds, you can visit our video from my colleague Brian over at Jamestown Settlement. Either option was common amongst the middle class. To have a raised bed with a straw mattress or a straw mattress on a pallet on the floor is just as likely as the other. But one of the key differences that kids are quite alarmed by when they come to visit our museum is that children did not spend time in their rooms and they did not have separate rooms. Kids oftentimes even shared their beds. So our notions of privacy in the modern day do not really align with the ideas of privacy in the past. People were living in much closer quarters, in other words. One of the questions that we get the most often from visitors is, how do we know what we know about people of the middle class in this area of Virginia in the later half of the 18th century? And that's a fantastic question. As people who study history, we want to make sure that we are using the most accurate information that we can if we're portraying the lives of people from the past. So one of the documents that we use is the inventory of Edward Moss. He was a real farmer in York County, Virginia, in the later half of the 18th century. He did not live this close to the port of York. He lived a little bit further into York County in the area known as Seaford today. So we have his inventory from when he passed away just after the war ended. In that time, people who died without a will, the county would send people out to make an account of all of their worldly possessions so that the estate tax could be assessed. And so we have those as valuable historical documents to know what type of belongings people had in the 18th century. So some of the things that you see here in our house are meant to represent items that are listed on the inventory, and we're going to list the inventory in the description below our video. So if you want to check that out, please do. But I'd just like to point out a few items. If you see the blue chairs in our house, those are meant to represent Mr. Moss's 6 best flag chairs. If you see items like the loom and the spinning wheels, those are listed on the inventory as well. All of our beds are listed on the inventory, as well as the desk and the dressing table and the dining room table. That is all listed on there. And one of the key things that we like to point out to visitors is the fact that Mr. Moss owned 6 enslaved people. And we do go a little bit more into the institution of slavery in this area in another video, and if you would like to learn more about it, please check it out. It's a very good video. So some of the other stuff that he has would be more applicable to the kitchen area because it lists things like crockery, cookware, dishes, that sort of thing. But it does give us a valuable insight into the lives of the people of the past. All right. If you look over here, you can see the inside, the back side of a lath and plaster wall. And oftentimes people are surprised to learn that people would have had plaster in the late 18th century. But we're never really surprised to learn about plaster in ancient Greece, ancient Rome, or even in Renaissance Italy. That's not surprising to us. So they did have plaster in this area. And if you look really closely, these laths, these small strips of wood that the plaster kind of squishes through and clings onto, these are split with a hand tool called a froe. And so to get that effect, you would have to use a hand tool for each one of these strips of wood. And it would be time consuming, but this kind of thing a farmer could do on his own. He would not need to purchase it. Something that he might need a little bit of outside help with would be the plaster itself. So plaster in this area, in Tidewater, Virginia, The primary ingredient would be lime that comes from oyster shells. We don't have any naturally occurring stone east of the fall line in Virginia. So in the Tidewater region, if you want plaster, you would have to bake down shells to get the lime content. And so the base layer of plaster is fairly coarse. It's got that lime from the shells, it's got sand and horsehair, and that gives you your base. And when we look on the other side, you'll see the smooth, more closer to plaster of Paris side that is the side that looks nice in the parlor. So in our hall for our farmhouse, something that people usually notice pretty quickly is that there's no wall coverings in here. There's no paneling, there's no lath and plaster, there's nothing but siding between us and the elements. And that is something, they did not pack their walls with insulation in this area because without keeping air conditioning in, there wasn't really any need for it. But it is something that we like to point out is intentionally done by our museum so that we can show how things are constructed in the time period. If we had covered this up with paneling, then you would not be able to see the bones of the structure and see how homes were built in the past. So it is valuable to point out that it is constructed using something called mortise and tenon joinery. And that is a subject that could take several videos to fully go into, but I would like to point out how instead of using nails to join the two timbers, you see a wooden peg. That wooden peg is called a trunnel, and that connects the mortise joint to the tenon. And that is a way of building in the past that doesn't need nails that are produced by a blacksmith. And that can be pretty cost effective. It can also be pretty sturdy because the wood expands and contracts at the same rate and it doesn't get kind of forced out over time. So it's a really sturdy, good way of building a house. And something else while we're on the subject of the walls would be lighting. We have a few things in our house as far as wall sconces, tin lanterns, lanterns with glass panes that are all for the purposes of lighting. People had candles in the time period, of course. There were different types of candles depending on how much money you wanted to invest in candles. And that is a subject that, again, could take several videos. But suffice it to say that folks of the middling sort would probably have a decent amount of candles that are either tallow or beeswax or both. That would not be so expensive that it would be outside of the realm of what they could have. So they would probably want to use those sparingly. They would not stay up very late past after dark time, but they would use them as they needed to if there was something that they wanted to accomplish after the sun goes down. And since some times of the year the sun goes down earlier than others, that's very useful.
All right. So another aspect of our farmer's home that's worth mentioning is the fact that our kitchen is not incorporated into the structure of our home. It is a whole separate building. So from where I'm standing at the back door of the farmer's house, you can look over and you can see the front door of our separate kitchen. And people of the time would cook out there year-round, so they would never feel the need in coastal Virginia to cook inside their home if they had that separate building. And if you want to learn a little bit more about cooking in our kitchen, we have some videos about different dishes that we've made that are based on real 18th century recipes. So please check those out. We'll list them in the description below. Thank you so much for watching our video today. If you liked this video, please click that like button and subscribe. If you have ideas of other content that you would like to see on our YouTube channel, please drop a comment in the area below the video. And don't forget to follow us on our social media pages on Facebook and Instagram. Thank you so much.